In the unforgiving crucible of public life, where image is not merely currency, but the very architecture of power, and perception is the kingdom over which all modern figures must reign, few self-inflicted implosions have been as comprehensive or as forensically revealing as the one executed by Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, during her appearance on the Aspire with Emma Grede podcast. What was meticulously planned and strategically positioned as a triumphant coronation of her post-royal business acumen, a masterclass in brand building intended to launch her new lifestyle venture, as ever, into the commercial stratosphere, metastasized in real time into a slow-motion cultural catastrophe. This was not simply a poorly handled interview. It was not just a public relations miscalculation or an off-key moment of messaging. It was the audible, seismic collapse of a carefully constructed narrative, the public demolition of a personal brand that had staked its entire value proposition on the very qualities, intelligence, precision, and aspirational savvy that were so spectacularly absent. The excruciating silence from the host, a titan of industry, was not just awkward. The subsequent, gleeful torrent of mockery from global media was not just cruel. The audience's collective verdict, a potent cocktail of bewilderment, derision, and unmistakable rejection, was the deafening sound of a myth unraveling. For years, Meghan Markle has been engaged in a high-stakes project of self-redefinition. From television actress to senior royal, from royal dissenter to global humanitarian, and, in her most ambitious pivot to date, from a figure of cultural controversy to a formidable entrepreneur and lifestyle guru. But within the supposedly safe, curated, and intellectually rigorous sanctuary of a top-tier business podcast, that final, most crucial illusion shattered into a million pieces. This was the precise, historic moment, the chasm between how Meghan Markle projects herself as a visionary architect of commerce and culture, and how a weary, skeptical public now perceives her as a purveyor of hollow, jargon-laden rhetoric, transformed from a discernible gap into an unbridgeable canyon. Her stated mission, on its face, was impeccably aligned with the modern playbook of celebrity capitalism: to unveil and articulate the philosophy behind her new brand, as ever. This was meant to be the triumphant culmination of her liberation from monarchical constraints, a powerful demonstration of her ability to transmute her global fame into a tangible, profitable, and culturally resonant business empire. It was designed to definitively silence the critics who questioned her substance and to establish her, once and for all, as a self-made titan in her own right. However, the interview's spectacular, slow-motion car crash, a veritable bonfire of credibility marked by meandering, vapid responses, the visible, nonplussed silence of her host, and the subsequent, gleeful explosion of viral mockery, revealed a far deeper, more troubling, and ultimately more tragic narrative. This was not merely a case of a celebrity having a bad day or a booking agent making a career-ending mistake. It was the tragic, inevitable, and spectacular culmination of a public-facing brand built on the fragile and unstable foundation of strategic ambiguity, the commercialization of an unearned sense of wisdom, and a profound, isolating, and demonstrably dangerous self-deception about the fundamental nature of business itself. That IT is a stark and cautionary tale about the immense perils of mistaking personal branding for business building, and the ultimate, crushing impossibility of constructing a kingdom of commerce on the fractured, haunted ground of hollow buzzwords. What could possibly compel Meghan Markle, a woman of global renown whose entire platform is predicated on a sophisticated understanding of image and communication, to willingly enter the lion's den of a serious business podcast, helmed by one of the sharpest minds in retail and venture capital, so catastrophically unprepared? What is the psychological calculus that leads one to believe that vague, therapeutic platitudes about feelings and intent could suffice as answers to concrete questions about market strategy, supply chains, and profit margins? The answer lies far beyond the cynical explanation of simple arrogance or a desperate need to stay relevant. It speaks to a profound, almost messianic belief in the power of her own narrative, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the world she now seeks to conquer. It is a psychological drama born from the very act that defined her post-royal existence, the pivot. By consciously, publicly, and dramatically amputating herself from the ancient institution of the British monarchy, Meghan did not just reject a family and a set of protocols. She rejected a preordained and immensely powerful brand identity. The monarchy, for all its heavily criticized faults, its colonial legacies, and its rigid anachronisms, provides its senior members with an undeniable and globally recognized brand framework. It offers structure, symbolic purpose, and a lifelong role in a national drama. The brand is the institution. The individual is its temporary vessel. In rejecting this, Meghan cast herself into a vast, unstructured wilderness of her own making, facing the monumental, quintessentially American task of building an identity and a brand from the ground up. This created a gaping existential and commercial vacuum that she has been frantically and very publicly trying to fill ever since. Her subsequent ventures, from the tearful confessions of her Netflix docuseries to the Spotify podcast archetypes, are not simply media projects or business deals. They must be understood as frantic, high-stakes attempts to construct a new, more meaningful identity, one that can retroactively justify the momentous, life-altering decision to leave. She cannot simply be. She must stand for something of great import. She must mean something to the world on her own terms. This deep-seated, existential need to matter, to be seen not just as a former duchess, but as a self-made mogul, a thought leader, and a secular prophetess of aspirational living, is the primary psychological driver that led her to that fateful podcast recording. It is a compulsion born of a unique form of loss. She did not lose a title in the way of abdication. She willingly surrendered it in pursuit of something she believed to be more valuable: freedom and fortune. The Aspire interview was meant to be the ultimate proof of concept. The moment she could finally demonstrate that the trade was not only worth it, but spectacularly successful. In her own mind, she was not merely a celebrity launching a lifestyle brand. She was a visionary on a sacred mission to perform the alchemical act of transmuting her unique personal journey into a universal, marketable philosophy. She appears to genuinely, fervently believe that her experience, navigating Hollywood, royalty, media scrutiny, and motherhood, has endowed her with a profound wisdom that the world, particularly its female consumers, desperately needs to hear and buy into. This is the dangerous intersection where a genuine, if misguided, sense of conviction meets an astonishing, almost breathtaking level of hubris. Surrounded by a Praetorian guard of staff, publicists, and wellness gurus in the insular, sun-drenched echo chamber of Montecito, she has likely been systematically shielded from the harsh reality of critical business opinion. Her confirmation bias has been fed a steady diet of praise by those who stand to gain, financially and reputationally, from the perpetuation of the myth of Meghan, the visionary. She almost certainly sat down opposite Emma Grede, suffused with the unshakable confidence of a person who believes they hold a profound and necessary truth, a truth that the world was simply waiting to receive. The very premise of her brand, as ever, and her podcast answers suggest a belief that the how of business is a tedious, pedestrian detail. The real magic, in her view, lies in the intention, the vibe, the feeling. She presented a business philosophy that sounded more like a yoga retreat mantra. A brand is more of a feeling than it is a structure, she famously mused, and the brand is really just a space for an intention. These were not slips of the tongue. They were the clearest possible articulation of her core belief system. She was there to sell the sizzle, seemingly unaware that her audience, personified by the razor-sharp Emma Grede, had come to inspect the steak. This wasn't a failure of preparation. It was a failure of ontology. She fundamentally misunderstands what a business is. The psychological journey that must have transpired during that excruciating interview is agonizing to contemplate in its distinct phases. Imagine the initial surge of performative confidence as she began, her mind and body conditioned by years of curated media appearances to project poise and control. She was in her element, or so she thought, a conversation, a platform, a receptive audience. Then, the first jarring shock to her nervous system. The polite, yet surgically precise questions from Emma Grede, questions about core markets, expansion strategies, product development, and key performance indicators. These were not hostile questions. They were the standard entry-level inquiries of Business 101. This is the moment of pure, undiluted cognitive dissonance, the point where the cold, hard reality of commercial enterprise clashes violently and irreconcilably with her carefully constructed internal narrative of brand as therapy. An actor, when forgetting a line, can recover. A politician, when cornered, can pivot to talking points. But Meghan's entire commercial proposition was built on the premise of her personal genius and insight. She was not playing a character. She was there as Meghan, the founder. The rejection of her answers was therefore not a rejection of a performance, but of her very essence as a purported businesswoman. The forced, pained smile that likely remained plastered on her face was a psychological mask, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to contain a dawning, creeping horror. The host's visible indifference to her abstract pronouncements, the professional stillness, the lack of enthusiastic follow-up, the subtle shift in posture that screams, "I am not buying what you are selling," was not just a lack of validation. It was a fundamental negation of her very purpose for being there. For a woman who has staked her entire post-royal identity on being the smart one, the strategic one, the one who could outmaneuver a 1,000-year-old institution, this very public and visceral manifestation of her commercial incompetence is not just an embarrassing moment. It is a profound narcissistic injury, a direct and brutal blow to her fragile, recently reconstructed sense of self as a captain of industry. Her speech, with its hollow, pre-packaged platitudes about kindness, resilience, community, and bringing light, became less a message for the audience and more a desperate incantation, a frantic attempt to convince not only the unimpressed entrepreneur before her, but also herself, of the continued validity of her precarious mission in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She was a woman trying to sell a cure for a disease she couldn't name to a crowd that was not only not sick, but didn't believe she was a doctor. The silence of Emma Grede, her refusal to promote the interview on her own channels afterward, was the most damning verdict of all. It was not the loud roar of a booing crowd. It was the cold, silent, professional execution of a failed idea. This deeply troubling psychological portrait is made all the more complex and fascinating by the reaction it provoked. A perfect storm of professional critique and public ridicule, with the satirist Jon Stewart acting as its gleeful conductor. Stewart's decision to dedicate a segment of his show to roasting the interview is a significant cultural marker. Stewart, a figure whose comedic authority is built on punching up at the powerful and hypocritical, saw in Meghan's performance a target too rich to ignore. By aiming his formidable satirical arsenal at her, he was making a powerful statement. Meghan Markle, in this context, was not an underdog or a victim. She had become the establishment, a new, Californian strain of it, clad in cashmere and spouting wellness jargon, but an establishment nonetheless, defined by a perceived disconnect between its pronouncements and its substance. His mockery was surgically precise. He didn't attack her character. He excoriated her incompetence, zeroing in on the repetitive, meaningless buzzwords, light, healing, and the archetype of potential. His coup de grace, the unveiling of a mock as ever candle with the label vague scent, vaguer mission, was more than a joke. It was a perfect, devastating crystallization of the entire critique. It transformed her abstract, high-minded rhetoric into a tangible, ridiculous object, exposing its commercial emptiness for all to see. It was an act of semiotic warfare, and it was brutally effective. The BBC News analysis, described as scathingly forensic, provided the institutional validation for Stewart's comedic assault. By dissecting the podcast in excruciating detail and posing the barbed, rhetorical question, if you launch a brand but can't explain how it works, does it really exist? The BBC shifted the narrative from simple celebrity folly to a serious case study in business failure. Guests on the program labeling her the queen of vagueness or comparing her brand pitch to a motivational speech written by a chatbot were not just trading insults. They were articulating a growing public sentiment that the Empress, indeed, had no clothes. The explosion of this sentiment online was the final democratized phase of the narrative collapse. The internet's conversion of the interview into meme gold, the global trending of the hashtag is severcleless, and the creation of parody accounts hawking fake, as ever products like accountability-free candles and intention-flavored t-shirts represent a uniquely modern form of public judgment. This is not passive consumption of media. It is active, participatory ridicule. It signifies a profound psychological disconnect between the brand identity Meghan sought to project and the one the public received. She offered up a hagiography of a visionary. The public responded by writing a satire of a charlatan. The anger, particularly from aspiring female entrepreneurs and business professionals, stemmed from a gross violation of a deeply held contract. They looked to figures like Emma Grede for inspiration and concrete advice, and instead, they were subjected to an unsolicited lecture on therapeutic spirituality masquerading as a business plan, delivered by a public figure they primarily associate with immense privilege and complaints about that privilege. This triggered a powerful and righteous feeling of being patronized, of having their own hard work and struggles trivialized by someone who seemed to believe success could be manifested through sheer force of will and a well-curated Instagram feed. Of course, this catastrophic event cannot and should not be viewed in isolation. It is the logical, ugly endpoint of a consistent and revealing pattern of psychological missteps and commercial failures that have charted the precipitous decline of her business credibility. It is a pattern defined by a single, tragic thread, overpromising and underdelivering, a spectacular launch followed by a quiet, ignominious fizzle. The ghost of her Spotify deal looms large over the wreckage of the Aspire interview. The multi-million-dollar agreement, hailed at its inception as a revolutionary moment in podcasting, ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The deal was terminated after a single season of archetypes, amid reports from industry insiders that the Sussexes had failed to meet the productivity benchmarks required to receive the full payout. Figures like Bill Simmons, a Spotify executive, publicly labeled them Fing grifters. While the Sussex camp would contest this narrative, the public perception was set. They had taken the money but failed to do the work. Critics now point to this episode not as an anomaly, but as part of a clear and repeating pattern. The Spotify debacle and the As Ever launch share the same DNA. Both were announced with tremendous fanfare, leveraging their royal-adjacent status to secure maximum media attention. Both were framed in lofty, world-changing terms. Archetypes was meant to dissect, explore, and subvert the labels that try to hold women back, while As Ever was about creating a community and bringing light. Yet, in both cases, when the time came to move from abstract mission statements to concrete execution and content delivery, the project faltered. The public, as one commentator wryly noted, wants content, not in other words, salad. This pattern reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the modern contract between a public figure and the public, especially in the commercial realm. Meghan Markle continues to operate as if her inherited celebrity status grants her an automatic platform and a right to be heard and consumed. But the world she now inhabits, the brutal, unforgiving world of direct-to-consumer brands and content creation, grants platforms based on perceived value. That value can be entertainment, expertise, inspiration, or a genuinely excellent product. Her value proposition, however, has become increasingly unclear. It seems to be simply her. The brand is Meghan. The product is Meghan. The philosophy is Meghan. And as the Aspire interview demonstrated, when the product itself is subjected to basic scrutiny, the entire enterprise falls apart. Her business credibility has not just stalled, it has been incinerated, turning her into a cautionary tale of branding without substance. The very entity of As Ever appears to be a ghost ship. Despite the flurry of launch day press, subsequent investigations revealed a startling lack of infrastructure. There was no clear team, no major retail partners announced, and a website that served as little more than a landing page for the same vague affirmations. Reports noted the lack of an official LLC registration in California under that name, leaving the entire venture feeling like a vanity project without an engine. Jon Stewart's quip that she wasn't building a brand, she was building a mirage cut so deeply because it rang so true. It felt less like a company and more like a placeholder, a desperate attempt to signal commercial activity and maintain relevance in the absence of any actual commerce. In conclusion, the unvarnished opinion this analysis seeks to impress upon the public consciousness is this: the 2025 Aspire with Emma Grede podcast appearance was not an accident, a gaffe, or a simple miscalculation. It was the inevitable, tragic, and richly symbolic result of a public-facing brand and a person hopelessly lost in a fractured, self-serving narrative of their own making. Meghan Markle presents to the world as a figure trapped in a painful and unsustainable paradox. She is a woman who is now publicly defined by the very commercial incompetence she so desperately sought to transcend. She is forced by the relentless demands of her new life in California to constantly perform a version of business savvy that feels, to a growing and vocal majority of the public, profoundly and fundamentally inauthentic. She has wrapped her personal ambitions in the lofty, aspirational language of universal wellness and conscious consumerism, and the public has finally and decisively stopped buying it. The future of Meghan's commercial ventures is now more precarious than ever. After such a public and humiliating repudiation by the very industry she seeks to join, what is the path forward? More interviews detailing the feeling of her brand will only deepen the public's fatigue and ridicule. The brand's survival may depend on a radical, humbling pivot away from personal philosophy and towards tangible products, concrete strategies, and demonstrable results. It requires a shift from being the visionary to perhaps hiring one, but it is unclear if its primary architect is psychologically capable of making that fundamental shift, as it would require an admission that her own core instincts were flawed. The true tragedy of the podcast debacle, therefore, lies not in the momentary embarrassment, but in what it represents psychologically. It marks the critical breaking point where a public figure seeking commercial credibility becomes a figure inspiring only memes of incompetence. It was the moment the public narrative shifted, perhaps irrevocably. She is no longer widely seen as a clever operator who outsmarted a monarchy. Instead, she is increasingly viewed as a privileged individual who has weaponized her own celebrity, unable or unwilling to see the vast, yawning chasm between her noble-sounding intentions and their grating, self-serving, and ultimately substanceless execution. The grand and ambitious mission to build a lifestyle empire cannot, and will not, be sustained on a foundation of abstract nouns and therapeutic jargon. The excruciating silence that filled the podcast studio was not just an absence of sound. It was the sound of that fragile foundation cracking apart, perhaps for good. It was the sound of a once compelling story that has finally and irrevocably lost its plot that we're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.